Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. Small-town America might not seem captivating, but one man managed to capture its beauty, joy, poignancy, in such a way as to entrance the whole of the nation and beyond. He was born in the Big Apple to Jarvis and Anna Marie Rockwell on the 3rd of February, 1894. He was given the name Norman Percival Rockwell. His father's family had deep roots into the American past. His ancestor, John Rockwell, having set foot upon this continent in 1635, Norman also had an older brother named after his father, Jarvis Jr. As Norman grew into a 6-foot-tall young man, his talents as an artist and desire to be one were clear, and he was allowed to leave his high school to attend the Chase Art School when he was only 14. This was during a time when people sought out entertainment and information from books, newspapers, and magazines. And books, newspapers, and magazines with illustrations sold better. Everyone who could draw or paint wanted to be an illustrator. It was the surest way to make a living, and the quickest way to become famous. Your images, and thus your name, could be seen across the country, every month, or even every week. For Norman, 2 more art schools followed, the National Academy of Design and the Art Students League. His teachers included Vincent de Monde, Thomas Fogarty, and George Bridgman. At the age of 18, his work was published in the book Tell Me Why, Stories About Mother Nature. He found his first success when his art was published in Boy's Life magazine, who hired him to the staff a little later. After some time, he was given the job of art editor. Boy's Life was a publication put out by the Boy Scouts of America. So much of Rockwell's work revolved around adventurous scenes of boys doing what Boy Scouts of the day were interested in. But his family was moving, so did he. At 21, he found himself living in New Rochelle, New York. Norman needed a studio to work in, and ended up sharing space with a man named Clyde Forsyth. Mr. Forsyth worked as a cartoonist for the Saturday Evening Post. This introduction would be a pivotal point in Norman's life, for with Mr. Forsyth's guidance, Norman submitted a painting, and on the 20th of May, 1916, his work entitled Mother's Day Off was published. In fact, he was such a hit that they published 8 covers of his that same year. Norman quickly moved to a boarding house, a young man flush with enough money to live on, when he noticed a lovely young lady moving in down the hall. He didn't know a whole lot about Irene O'Connor, but he knew she was beautiful. She was single. He was feeling like a big man who'd finally made it after all. And well, she was there. Smitten with her, he proposed during a telephone call, and she accepted. They wed on July 1st, 1916, in Potsdam, New York. He was 22, and she was 19. It wasn't a big wedding, though it did take place in the Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church. It was a small, hasty affair in the private study of the priest. There were problems with the marriage from almost day one. They were, after all, kids, and really, they didn't even know each other very well. And it turned out that they hardly had anything in common. It's not as if they fought. They simply had nothing to talk about, because they enjoyed very different things. Norman continued to paint as usual. His loveless marriage seemed to give Norman the time to do an awful lot of work. He had a few other magazine covers for Life, Literary Digest, Leslie's Weekly, and Country Gentleman. But the Post wanted him full-time, so he went to work for the Saturday Evening Post. He did find time, however, to do some work for the American Red Cross monthly magazine. But they both partied through the 1920s, as did most young people then, and ended up having affairs. Not that either of them even minded. They were only married on paper by that point. They managed to stay together for 14 years, never had children. But, as was bound to happen, one of them fell in love, for real this time. Irene had met a man named Francis Hardy Jr. Norman wasn't surprised. The writing had been on the wall forever, so she traveled to Reno, Nevada in 1930 and acquired a speedy divorce. At the time, it was far easier to divorce in Nevada than anywhere else in the U.S. A mere 10 days later, Irene remarried, this time to Francis. Her life didn't go as planned, however. 2 years passed, and Irene was unwell. She was brought to Belmont, Massachusetts, and admitted to the McLean Asylum. In 1934, 2 years after her admittance, she was given a short leave to attend her mother's funeral. During this time on the outside, she managed to drown herself in her mother's bathtub. Probably a case of suicide. Norman's life went a little better, and you may think that Irene married quickly after divorcing. But Norman didn't wait long either. After Irene divorced him, Norman needed a change of scenery, so he quickly packed up and headed to California, just to get away for a while. Only 3 months later, he was engaged, and a month after that, remarried. This time, the girl's name was Mary Barstow. She was 12 years younger, and it took only 2 short weeks for them to become engaged. As with his first wife, she too was a teacher. Their large wedding ceremony was conducted by a minister in Hellenbrook, California, and in the backyard of her parents' house. When World War I began, Norman found himself suddenly cursed by his slender frame. He wanted to join and fight with everybody else, so he binge ate in order to weigh more, so that he could enlist. The day before, he'd been turned down for weighing too little for his height, only 140 pounds. When he went back to enlist, they accepted him. However, while his friends went to fight at the front, the military had noticed his artistic talents and instead kept him from fighting by using him to create art for the cause. He worked on patriotic posters and pamphlets. Mary and Norman moved back to New Rochelle, New York, and it was then that they began to have their sons. Jarvis was first, in 1932. Thomas followed, in 1933, and Peter was the last, in 1936. Time went on, and his family grew. Everything seemed right. The 1920s were over. The Great Depression hit everyone hard, but the Rockwell family managed. In 1935, there was another change of scenery. From New Rochelle to the small town of Arlington, Vermont, just 2 towns north of Bennington. They lived there for over 10 years. Norman used locals as models for his art, something he would do for many years to come. And then the Second World War began, and Norman found a new calling, painting scenes of American pride, including his famous 4 Freedoms series: the freedom from fear, the freedom from want, of speech, and of worship, inspired by a speech given by Franklin D. Roosevelt. The paintings were taken on tour to inspire the sale of war bonds. However, a fire would destroy many of his works soon afterward. Norman was devastated, but determined to continue his work. There was a short, awkward moment when Norman was asked to join a small team in the production of a daily comic strip, but his perfectionist tendencies kept him from working quickly enough to make his job feasible. The Otis College of Art and Design became his winter location. The school took him on as artist in residence, and Norman was able to spend the colder months in the warmth of Southern California, sometimes accompanied by his family, sometimes not. But something was wrong. Mary wasn't herself. As the years went on, Mary began to drink and fought heavily with long bouts of depression. In reality, the poor woman never had a moment to figure herself out, always lost in the identity of someone else. From her parents' protection, straight to being Mrs. Norman Rockwell, her own name gone in the fame of her husband's. And he was already famous by then. His magazine covers stared up from hundreds of thousands of coffee tables a month across the country. Then she suddenly had 3 small boys, only her to care for them, and every mother knows, especially back then, when most moms didn't work, everything becomes secondary to their needs, to developing those kids into fully functioning people. A mom gives up her own identity for them, but it was all too much for her, and far too fast. She was the pillar of that home, taking care of all the family's needs, so that Norman had time to work on his art. At the end of it all, what was left of poor Mary? The whole family moved in 1953 south to the Berkshires, to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, right down the street and around the corner from the Austin Riggs Center, a psychiatric hospital and center for treatment. Times were very stressful for the family. Sometimes their mother would go to the hospital to stay a few days. Sometimes she'd be let out to visit them for a while, in and out, for longer and longer stretches at a time. She could some days be seen walking out alone, trying to calm herself back down. For 6 long years, she received treatment there. Norman took a studio on the 2nd floor of a building on Main Street, where from the window he was able to watch the comings and goings of the locals. Just as with those up in Arlington, Vermont, Stockbridge locals ended up as models for countless drawings and paintings. But it didn't just attract locals. Famous names of all types flocked to Stockbridge to be painted by Rockwell himself. My dad recalls the story of eating in the greasy spoon under Norman's studio and watching John Wayne walk by with his signature swagger, looking for the door to the 2nd floor. Though as good as things were going for Norman in the art world, his wife wasn't recovering, then suddenly died of a heart attack. But it may not have been as simple as a heart attack. After a possible attempt to end her own life, Austin Riggs transferred her to Connecticut, the Institute for Living in the city of Hartford. She was put on a potent cocktail of drugs, and in an attempt to change the very workings of her mind, subjected her to electroshock therapy. Those two therapies, combined with her weakened health caused by years of alcoholism, are thought to have played a part in her heart attack. Norman was a workaholic and a perfectionist, and because he was so focused on his work, it's very possible that this alienated both his wives. The first simply created her own life of frivolity and drink. The second worked hard to manage his life and his children's, worked her fingers to the bone for him, and it drove her to drink too. In the end, both ended up in mental hospitals, and then dead. Dr. Erik Erikson is said to have told Rockwell that he painted his happiness, but did not live it. Norman's love lives were difficult, to say the least, and this time Norman waited a little more than a year before marrying again. Molly was, who'd have ever guessed, a teacher. They met at the Lenox Library, where she was teaching a class in poetry. She was about 3 years younger than he, and they wed in Stockbridge in 1961. They crossed the country and back for their honeymoon, and she was good for him. She had had her own life, knew her own mind, had no children, and wasn't very interested in creating any. His children were grown, which allotted Norman and Molly time to spend together. She was a strong-willed breath of confident fresh air. Her father, James Punderson, had helped Mr. Allen T. Treadway make numerous improvements and modernizations to the Red Lion Inn, then owned by Treadway's uncle, Mr. Plum, before the 1896 fire. Molly had been born Mary Leet Punderson and was proud of her family's long history in the Berkshires. Work continued anew for Norman. His new wife lit a new flame for the artist who suddenly found himself riding a bicycle around town with her. He moved his studio to a small red building on the property of their South Street home. Norman started to feel like something should be done to safeguard all of the original works that remained in his possession, and as if kismet, an opportunity arose to give him an option. The Corner House, an old colonial home that stands on Main Street in Stockbridge, was at the risk of being demolished in 1967. Norman and Molly Rockwell were part of a group who saved the old home and turned it into the Stockbridge Historical Society. To attract attention, Norman lent a large number of his works to the society to display in the old home. This then became the first home of both the Stockbridge Historical Society and the Norman Rockwell Museum. Just before this, his son had helped him write his autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator. After 47 years and 323 covers, Norman's last cover for the Saturday Evening Post was published. He continued to do some work for Look magazine, as well as side work, like portraits. He painted well into his later years, including at the age of 82, an image called The Spirit of 76, for a Boy Scouts of America calendar. It would be his last for them. He'd done work for the Boy Scouts for 64 years, about 471 illustrations and images. But Norman had always been fond of smoking. Images of him with his pipe have become iconic. His breath became gradually shorter until he was diagnosed with emphysema. He was 84 when the disease finally caught up with him, and he passed away in his Stockbridge home in 1978. He was buried in the far back left corner of the Stockbridge Cemetery. Rosalind Carter attended his funeral, First Lady of the United States at the time. His museum flourished long beyond his time. There are currently 3 Norman Rockwell museums. One in Rutland, Vermont, a few towns north of his Arlington, Vermont home, where they lived for 14 years, starting in 1939. The museum was established in 1976. There's also an exhibit of his art in Arlington, Vermont, the town in which he once lived. Each work is shown alongside stories of those who knew him. In the museum he started in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, moved out of the corner house that it shared with the Stockbridge Historical Society, and relocated its collection to a grand new building just for his art. It is now the largest and most complete collection of his original paintings, drawings, and artifacts from his life in the world. Norman Rockwell's home in Stockbridge is not a museum. However, the red studio that used to stand on the property was cut in two in 1986, and half at a time moved to the edge of town and reassembled in a picturesque clearing near his new modern museum. You can go visit it when you go to the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge. He called it his best studio yet, and he had had many over the years. Norman made certain it would be preserved by adding it to the trust that contained much of his artwork in 1967. Just before his death, Norman was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor a citizen can receive for vivid and affectionate portraits of our country, which is odd, considering many other artists didn't consider him one. I've worked as an artist myself, and I've always found it baffling the way that some artists like to downplay the work of others by calling it anything other than art. Considering what people will pay a fortune for in the name of art, I can't figure out what the difference is. How is it that the work of an old master and the work of someone who essentially splatters paint on a canvas can both be called art? But Rockwell was labeled as only an illustrator. Now don't get me wrong, he used the term for himself. He did illustrate, for stories and magazine covers after all. It's how he made the bulk of his living, because in the teens and 20s, that was the best way to get your work seen. Everyone strove to be an illustrator, but as times changed, so did that attitude. But despite what other artists would say about him, he illustrated in only the highest quality, most meaningful, poignant, and thought-provoking art. Art at the highest level. Art that embodied and still embodies the ideals and dreams of this American nation. He touched on the most American of everyday moments. A soldier and his sweetheart, a Boy Scout and his dog, a tough little girl with a big grin and a black eye, proud after standing up for herself. He also tackled the biggest and most all-encompassing values that we strive for: equality, freedom, education, and the trust that the rights fought for and won by those Americans before us will ensure us all a fair and happy future. In my humble opinion, it's not painting large squares of various colors with a wide brush or abstract close-ups of flowers that makes one an artist. It's creating something that changes how people see the world and themselves. And that's absolutely, without a doubt, what Norman Rockwell did, no matter what you want to call what he made. Art or illustration. There's hardly anyone who doesn't know his name, or who hasn't seen his work. And I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to be for ages to come. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or at our website, www.theberkshiresgoneby.com. There you can see images related to our episodes, and find all the episodes made so far. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.